Timed. All right. Hey, welcome to another edition of New Wine UnCorked. And we are stoked to be with you here this Friday again. And so if you're joining us live on Facebook, good morning to you. And if you're catching this late, maybe this weekend, watching this over the weekend, or even during the week, Monday, Tuesday, thanks for joining us. As always, New Wine has a multitude of things going on throughout our culture, and some of the things you can find here on YouTube. And so there's New Wine Tastings. Dr. Metzger, the director of New Wine, has been doing a series on advocacy, and he did a series on the Beatitudes. And so you can find that right here on the YouTube page. So if you just go right over to the bottom part right here and you hit subscribe, or on the video right here at the very end, there's a subscribe button. And then when you subscribe, just hit that little bell right there next to it. And so that way you'll be notified for any time that New Wine uploads videos or happenings that have been going on within our New Wine family. And so today we're continuing the discussion with the gospel message. And last week we were talking about, are we victorious in, or have we been kind of inoculated from this goodness that the gospel messages they proclaim? And so with the continued dialogue of how are we going to do fall, if you have kids in school age, that's a big discussion now. And depending on where you're at in your local cities, the big discussion too is like shopping. Are they going to mandate masks again and things like this? And then in the midst of all this, we have the Olympics going on. And so it kind of draws into this idea of who we are as people. And we are very competitive people. And so we have a lot of comparisons and stuff. And yet the gospel preaches this message of peace and love. And so today we're going to continue to talk about this in the gospel's goodness, but how does that play out today in a culture that has kind of a win at all cost mentality? How does a gospel that preaches peace, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, how does this come to fruition in a culture that seems to be about consuming the other for the sake of myself and my, moving up the chain, whatever metaphor you want to talk about? And so, gentlemen, we were talking even before this about our roles as pastors and how things are going. How does the church do this? It's not anything new, navigating between the streams of culture and then the reality of the church. But amidst COVID, even with the excitement of the Olympics, which is competition, and it pushes us all into compete, because let's be realistic, last night or this morning, it was about 3 a.m, I was watching the finals for the wrestling. I get competitive, when David Taylor or Sarah Hildebrand and these wrestlers are going against other nations, I'm like, get that, yes, America, and USA wrestling. And well, there's a competitive thing, and it's exciting. Like Jim, you were talking about, I actually was bummed when I saw that the basketball team lost, even though it was the first rounds and stuff. I was like, what? We don't lose, and so competitive, competition. My kids compete, we compete in our household and things. And even the Apostle Paul says, look, I strove to be the best, right? The greater than all the apostles in what though? So it seems like there is an aspect of competition that could be positive. But in a consumeristic society and culture, what does the church have to be mindful of? As your roles of pastor and in my role as a pastor and our roles within New Wine, we talk about this dude who is God, who is love, and we want to walk in his way, in his truth, and so as to emulate his life. How is that? Is it possible in a consumeristic, competitive culture and still love on each other, but still not be Debbie Downers? You know what I'm saying? When we come to the Olympics and they're like, don't let Matt, he's a Christian, and competition, he's going to be like, hey, So how do we do that in a win at all cost culture? How does the gospel message still bring peace and goodness?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to frame the question, Matt. I'm probably the least competitive person you will ever meet. So I never have a win at all costs. I don't mind just playing.
I bet you're not. I'm least competitive than you are.
Oh, so okay. So we're competing now for the least competitive person. That's great. But it's difficult for me to understand sometimes people being extremely competitive. I played sports and everything like that and played hard and that kind of stuff. It was good. But at the same token, like my boss right now is probably the most competitive person I've ever been around. He'll talk trash to anyone playing any game, and that's the thing. But I could probably debate that he's the most loving person that I've met as well. And so those two things can coexist. It's just during times of competition, it may not feel like that. When it comes to, at least from what I've seen from my boss, as he's sharing the gospel with people, he becomes competitive in the sense of demonstrating love. Am I doing this the best I can? Is every interaction something that gives off Jesus? That's kind of the backdrop of every interaction that's around him. One of the things we talk about in our job is is taking advantage of teachable moments. So literally, we'll just be having a random conversation about basketball or something like that. And if something happens to come upon a some type of discipleship topic, he's jumping right on it. And for the next hour, you're locked in the conversation. and so and so it's been really interesting. And he challenges and pushes us to be aware of those moments, to turn those moments into productive conversations. So those are ways that I've seen competition turn into showing the love of Christ, showing being a person of discipleship, is just taking advantage of all those moments and just not trying to miss any of them. So yeah.
Oh. Yeah.
Well, don't the competitiveness towards love, I agree. Like, so trying to be the better person, right? To love and or to serve the other is a form of competition. I guess it's to be the best person, right? So we're competing against ourselves in some sense, right? And so that's a proper form. But all around us though, even so when you get out of that culture though, so you have a boss and you have people around you that are like, yes, let's love and what happens though when the rest of the group though, when you're outside of that, some of the tools that we can have to where we don't get sucked into it? Because my question to both you guys is, how has it been that you've grown into this, or have you always been that way where you're like, competition, cool and everything, but it doesn't drive me, or I don't get fired up? Was there a time where you did, because if you compete in sports, do we have to have that kind of, and I don't know, because the sports that I've done, like with wrestling, it's all about domination. And it's all about, when you're there one-on-one with the person, if you're nice, I mean, you could get hurt, and so trying to envelop that, allowing that mentality to be something that we envelop in. Okay, when I'm on the mat or when I'm in the even in the boardroom, right, in the business office, like a lot of businesses based on merit, or sales or things where you're competing against one another. But so how do we as the church though get people to say, hey, we want to strive to be whatever the best Christian is, without then getting into, well, that's a good person and that's a bad person?
Yeah, I think it's community, right? I mean, I think it's the broader sense of, yeah, I think probably maybe one of the problems with this whole COVID thing is people have a tendency to listen to people that they like to listen to, right? And so it's like this echo chamber. So you listen to the same people over and over. And so you start getting these ideas, oh, this is what it means. This is what it means to succeed as a Christian. And I think that the reality is that we need to broaden the relationships that we have. Because you know what, there's believe it or not, there's Hawaiians that are Jesus followers. There's Irish that are Jesus followers. I mean, heaven forbid, and I say this tongue in cheek, but also there's LGBTQ plus people that are followers of Jesus and are devoted followers and lovers of Jesus. And so I think, for us to understand what does it mean to love is to get a broader perspective, a broader understanding, a broader taste of what love is within other contexts, and how Jesus works in these other contexts, not only in, America's context, or I would even say the empire's context.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, I'm thinking of also the passage from Hebrews 10, encouraging one another to love and good works. If that's part of our culture where we're not simply saying, hey, man, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, but the spaces where we're doing well, where we're demonstrating love well, let's encourage that. Let's continue to do that in different spaces, and find out just find out where we can do that in different spaces. And let us not be a culture where we're consistently saying, oh man, you did this wrong, or this church has failed, or anything like that. We love to revel and roll around in that kind of stuff. It's just like, why don't we love to roll around in the other things, and in the encouraging things and the good works and the like that we see Christians doing across the city or across the country?
Yeah. That's really good, Phil. So, Matt, you brought up wrestling. So
Yeah.
when I was in college, I was a PE major and I had to take a wrestling class. And so, and it was kind of wrestling coaching. And so we broke up in groups, and he says, okay, 2 rounds, 30 seconds. So I'm like thinking, this will be easy because I, watch, WWF. I figured, I'll just come off the turnbuckle and put my guy down. I remember after that class, I was like, I go back to the locker room and there was no way I could get that, that deeper breath, that. And so even in the next, the next class, and we had to kind of build up, and I think you're going to laugh at this, but I think, I had to build up to be like 1 minute for 3 rounds. Right. But that's, for somebody that doesn't do that, that is tough. And so I remember when he blew the whistle, it's kind of like I flipped over on my back and I just go pinned, and the instructor's like, get up. And, and I think, maybe and to me, people, I've played football, high school level and coach, but you know what, to me, wrestling is like the toughest sport because it's just that constant, that constant pressure. But I think, it's too easy. I think when we start to go into other cultures and see Jesus in action, it's really hard for us. It can be physically and emotionally draining. Right. And so I think, it's being able to kind of, and I'm grateful for my instructor because he made me go, I was able to go, I think 2 rounds, for a minute, but I was able to to once we go into those other cultures and other people and see how Jesus lives and how Jesus is, brought to life, if you will. I think that's what's important in understanding. And then also it teaches us to love ourselves. I think that's the other obstacle, is just the lack of loving ourselves, or thinking we're good enough, or, thinking that I'll just flip over on my back and, it'll be over. But, the guy goes, hey, get up, and I think Jesus tells us, hey, you know what, get up and stop,
Yeah, well, because the weird thing is like with talking about the competition and the working into, I think there's a process of, it sounds weird, but you have to learn how to love, especially too and this is what Jim, you brought this up, and I can't remember who you said told you this, but where they look at the way that the Americans evangelize, and it's about the goodness, and which is great, right? It's always joy, happy. Hey, if you say yes to Jesus, then whatever you've always wanted to be better with you is going to happen. Whereas I think you were saying, your friend or someone said, you guys got to, like, we talk to people about like how hard it's going to be. Like this is, And so I wonder though, with our competitive nature within the church, though, we're so competitive about numbers that we don't fight for numbers right up front, but the way we fight for them is we make the gospel more palatable for people in front of us, where we don't tell them, oh, by the way, Jesus says, the world will hate you because why the world hated me. And no one likes hate. Even if you didn't have a grandmother in your house, someone was telling you, oh, we don't hate people, and so even within that sense, like the learning to love, how does the church though draw people in? Dr. Metzger talks about, going through our convictions, not around them. So how do we do that though? Having the convictions with people we disagree with, but not being competitive enough to where it's about winning them. And yet there still wants to be a winning over, because if you're living Jesus, you want the person in front of you to have that same love for them. So there has to be kind of like a push, but how do we do that gently?
One of the ways I think we can do that is, and I think you kind of both have brought this up, but learning how to love yourself, how God has made you, how God has shaped you, that you don't have to think that, okay, this person's gifted more than me. I need to be like, I need to be this. But it's just simply, okay, this is how God has gifted me. This is how God has made me. And I live into that and live into what that gifting looks like, and knowing that God loves me the way he made me. And rolling forward with that's kind of the beginning of it, where we don't have to aspire to be. I mean, there are spaces, yes, where we want to be within who we are, where we want to be the best of who we are. But there's something when we switch and we want to be like this person, we want to be like something else. We have to understand who we are and learn to love that, because God loved that. God loved the person He put together. So,
yeah. We talked about this too a while back. It's just about language, right? And so we use language like winning somebody for the Lord, or this whole this whole thing, this understanding of what it is. Then also, even in language, you brought this up, Matt, about if you're not loving, you must be hating. But people will say, well, I'm not a hater, and so that because they don't hate, they think I'm loving. But really, as we know, love isn't. I mean, the opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. The opposite of love is just not getting involved. It's it's just kind of not saying it, not standing up for the other, or loving your neighbor and things like that. And so, I think sometimes, I think a lot has to do with our language and even just empire mentality, right? It's like we're in. We made the team, and so let's just we're in. And so it's not this whole idea of bettering ourselves or bettering those around us, right? Or the kingdom of God is, on earth as it is in heaven type of mentality. But it's like, hey, I'm in, and I'm just going to ride this out.
Do you think it's interesting, because we're going through here in California with the start of like the schools for the university, as well as high school and junior highs, and the mask debate, as well as the vaccine. And I don't know where this comes into play, because I do believe that as a nation, the more children we expose to education and the more that we give education, the better people we will be, right? But in our process of pushing education, it's like here, I'm speaking specifically in the Northern California area, where they're debating on whether or not, if you have people on campus, do they have to have a vaccine kind of thing? And where a lot of students are pushing back and saying, hey, you can't tell me this or that. And I wonder, so even in our non-competitive, because the church wants to be loving and inclusive, in the including everyone though, does that though leave out a group? Like when we're trying to be all inclusive and saying, and they're dealing with this, oh, you can't force people into have a vaccination because they have the right to education. And so then you can't tell them what they can and cannot do. Is that a form though of this competition where we get so competitive with the other that we can't even work in a community though? Because when we start to go community, the moment you say, oh, well, we need to step back, I get defensive because you're going to take away something from me. Because once I say yes to the community, there has to be a lessening of self, right? You have to make space in order to embrace the other. And so there is a, whatever you want to call it, sacrifice or a letting go, or some even would say suffering. If I don't get what I want, then I'm suffering. How is that mentality though transformed into seeing the need for community?
The how of that question is the most daunting part, because the fact that we need to do it is one thing. And I think all of us will look around and think that there's ways in which we need to be more loving towards another person, that we have to see the same framework, but see it as wearing a mask as I get to do something for somebody. That's how to switch that off. I don't know how to switch that off. Like, I mean, I try to do it personally, but how do you get a church culture to do it? That we haven't been about it. It's like, I mean, Jesus's example, like we should have already been here. I mean, maybe that's the part that's getting me. It's like we should have already been here. Jesus did everything he did on behalf of us. It's like, what are we missing? I don't. Yeah, that's frustrating to me. That's all I kind of have. That's frustrating to me.
Yeah. I think the community decides, but I think it's a mutual respect. I mean, even the term, like when you use all inclusive, I think it's a really cool term, but it's like, ain't gonna happen. I mean, in the bigger picture, it's just, that's a great term, but it's one of those terms that it ain't gonna happen. But I think, at least for our church, we have reasons, and we're not gonna, whether people are vaxxed or not. I mean, we're gonna have everybody, wearing masks once we get back in. And so we're going to have to be making these big decisions. But, my feeling is you take care of the community. You take care of, we're called to shepherd the people. And so, I'm not going to let my own, I guess you go to the person, you go to the least vulnerable person and you go from there, right? Isn't that what Jesus is saying? Throughout the scriptures and in the Old Testament, we hear about the least, the last, the least. You go to the most vulnerable, and those are the ones you care for first. And maybe that's where it begins, because for us in our church, we have older people, we have the kapunas, we have, young children. And so they're the most vulnerable. So we go to them and say, how do we take care of them? How do we make sure that they feel safe? Whether they want to come to church or not, they want to wait, but how do we take care of them? Maybe that's the answer. Maybe we go to the least vulnerable and say, how do we make sure that we're taking care of them? And maybe the perspective is when we go to schools, or as schools start to go, instead of looking at our rights as adults, we look at the needs of the most vulnerable and say, how do we make sure that we're not going to lose this one child?
Yeah, and in addition to that, I like that. I think that's gets us closer to the how, because I think part of our perspective is what grasps the most people, what's going to hit the bigger target. So rather than focusing on the one that's the most vulnerable, I'm thinking of the most people there. So that's definitely a good perspective that we can bring to this conversation, whether it be church or any place else. What's that most vulnerable, and working towards helping that person. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think too, for me, is that because we live in this society where we're very entitled to things. Even the choice of vaccines is entitlement, right? It's an entitlement. And so whether, to argue whether you do it or not, that's entitlement. But, a friend of mine who works with, it's called Loom International, and they work with women and children, you get this email that says, Africa, 5% of there's only 5% of people that are vaccinated, and people, and their economy is falling apart, and people are just, in wanting vaccine, they want to be able to be vaccinated because of, the death that they're seeing. And so sometimes I think, again, it's just the broader perspective. It's just this wider perspective of, here we are in the United States arguing whether we should do this or not. And then there's, countries around us that are just saying, okay, you know what, how about, and what's going to happen as soon as we start sending it to them, people are going to start complaining and saying, how come we're giving it? People are here dying, and so it's just this wild, crazy, but I think it's a global perspective.
I'm sorry.
No, go on, Phil. Yeah.
Also forgetting, just that what you said right there, thinking of other countries that haven't had the opportunity to have the vaccine in their country as available. They don't have it available at all in many ways, right? And we have so much that we're able to choose whether or not to do it. We forget just where the bottom is. We forget how vulnerable people actually are, even arguing about this. Well, I haven't been sick. And then what are the stories that we heard just a couple of weeks ago? People in the hospital saying, well, give me the vaccine now, as they're getting the ventilator put on. And it's like, dude, this is what we were warning you about.
Yeah.
So it bleeds into other issues, but forgetting the vulnerability that we have. I live with a daughter that's is a immune system vulnerable right now, right? And so yeah, it wasn't a question whether or not, it was just a question as to when I was going to get the vaccine. It wasn't a question when I was going to get it, when I could get it available to me, how soon as I could get there, I was going to get it. And yeah, man, it's just we forget just how vulnerable people can be. Just because I wasn't sick, or I don't know anyone personally or in my near circle that was sick, then therefore no one's ever going to get sick. This horrible logic is crazy. So
it's weird too, because it's not weird, it's human, but we do it too. My family, the four of us, my kids are older, so they're out of high school, they're both in university. Kayla graduated, but so we're in a different phase where we're pretty healthy, in the sense that we don't have a scare of if someone gets sick, or like, let's say there's someone unvaccinated and they get sick. My family kind of is like, well, we're good. We're vaccinated, and so we're fairly healthy, but it's taking that next step and saying, okay, I know though that one of the things that vaccinated people can be is carriers. And so and I have to admit, early on after I got the vaccine, and then once this whole thing started to press into, wear masks or not, I was one of those people who was walking in the store saying, whatever, man, I got the vaccine, dude. This is the whole point, man. Getting irritated. And my wife's like, Matt, this is the way. And I'm like, you know what? They can love themselves because I went out and got the vaccine. Right. And so like, and I look, dudes, I have to admit that to myself, because if I don't, then I when I start to judge others, which I do, I have to step back. Right. And so, but I feel like I'm in a pretty good place, with my relationship with Jesus and all that stuff. I wonder though, both of you and myself have experienced it in the past, but like when something happens, like tragedy, let's say, or when things don't go our way, sometimes I find that's when those Christians, I do it, where I'm like, the righteous living and all that kind of, what's the point, because when you tell me about this God of love, and I mentioned this, I think last week, when we talk about the promises fulfilled, we always point to the Old Testament most of the time. When it comes to the New Testament and then moves into the 21st century, all I feel like is it's just this slide downward into a, whatever, adjective you want to call as to what we have here, the inferno, whatever, hell on earth. I don't know. It seems like that when we say, ooh, love, I hear that and go, I so badly want that to be the case. But I look around just in my life too, when I assess who I am, my ability to even love myself so is factored into my emotional state at the time, to where if I don't get something that goes my way, it's so much easier for me to be a hater than a lover. And I'm struggling with this too. And yet I have a role of leadership within the church and churches with New Wine. We're talking about engagement and culture. How is it though that I can draw into this community and say, no, this God of love is real. Like I feel it, I know about it, but I'm at a level because of 20 years into a faith. Like early on though, it would have been easy for me if some of the tragedy or some of the suffering that we've had to experience happened at a different time. I think my wife and I might've just been like, it was a good run for this faith thing. I'm out, because I have people in my life who don't love Jesus. And if I'm honest with myself, I look and sometimes I'm jealous of the way they live. They seem to live better.
What do I want to say? Thinking of the book of Psalms, so many lament Psalms that address that directly, that thinks of that directly. But yeah, that's part of the reality. But I think perspective becomes is part of the conversation we're having here, and it applies to this as well. If this is the life that we have, if whatever years we get to live on this earth is what we have, then yeah. Enjoy, eat, drink, be merry, because tomorrow you die. That's it, But if we have a life thereafter, then there's things that we need to imply in our life. There's things that we need to add to our life. We'd have a different perspective. So I think it changes up the perspective that makes much of our walk different from non-believers and the like. But yeah, it does seem so often that we just don't have that other perspective, that we get trapped into this is the life that we have. And so we're competing on this stage when there's a far greater stage at hand. So,
yeah. I like that, Phil. You brought up an interesting point, Matt, when you talked about, I'm vaccinated, I'm going into the stores, I'm not going to wear a mask. And isn't that what the gospel sometimes is? we feel like we've been vaccinated with Jesus, right? And so, well, and I think sometimes, books are good. So in our indigenous culture, so like, so we're an oral tradition, right? And so we're sharing stories, it's oral. But you know what? I think one of the benefits of not having a book is that books kind of put things in time, right? And says, okay, this is what happens. Where oral traditions are constantly changing, right? And so, something happens, something might have happened 2,000 years ago. And there might have been a story that went with that 2,000 years ago, but over time that changes. Thoughts have changed, or, situations have changed. And so the story that was shared 2,000 years ago, I might not hear the same story, but there's kind of a revision to the story because of the experience, right? And so I wonder if, like, what we don't understand is that the gospel is an ongoing story. It's written down. The scriptures are important. They bring life, but also within that, the Holy Spirit has this we have an oral tradition as far as how we live out our lives. And so, I wonder if, like, when we say, hey, I've been inoculated with Jesus, this is what I understood about Jesus, because we all come from different backgrounds. I mean, we've, whether it be Baptist or whatever denomination, whatever flavor, but there's a certain thing that we value in the people that we look up to. And so when we're inoculated, it's like, oh, this is what it means to be a Christian, right? And so we kind of like stay there. And then we say, baptism, masks, nah, I don't need that. Or, yeah, you better do that, and we kind of get locked into that. But, like you said, in this vaccine thing, we're learning, because it's dynamic. I mean, it's constantly moving, right? So we're needing to learn. And as frustrating as it gets, the frustrating part is when people say, no, this is what I was told before, so I'm going to stick with this, and keep changing their minds. Well, it's like, dudes, this is like never happened before. So like, give some space. And so, I wonder if the gospel, we get that vaccine, we've been vaccinated by Jesus, right? And so now I'm like, all right, I'm in. But the reality is like, really? I mean, I've got my neighbor is really the homeless. My neighbor is really a person of color. My neighbor is really this person, instead of just like, oh no, my neighbor is the person that lives next to me and I love him, right? But there's, I think, this, I mean, it's a great idea. I love that idea that you brought, because we get so stuck about that, but then we got to change, right? And that's what the gospel does. It changes. I mean, they're ongoing as we learn. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, because when we're talking to people about Jesus, evangelism, I do wonder sometimes, and in some of my classes, I just pose the question, is it too easy to be a Christian in the 21st century, according to the American church, right? Because if you told me some of the stuff that, like, Jesus says to his apostles, right? Like, when they're going to follow him, like, dude, the guy's like, hey, I got to bury my dad. And he's like, yeah, no, move on. And I'm like, dude, that's not a very compassionate response, is it? And yet, like you were saying, Phil, Jesus understands that life is not just here on earth. However, he understands, and I was listening to this guy preach this weekend, and he was saying how, I don't know what his intent was, but he was saying heaven's not our point, our purpose. Like, people think heaven is the point. And I get what he's saying, because he was then talking about like loving, like taking care of the earth and this kind of stuff. And like, but he kept talking about going back, building the garden here now. And my thing is I don't want to go back to the garden. I think Jesus says we're going beyond the garden, right? And so when we talk about like this idea of Jesus entering into our midst, and for heaven, like you're saying, Phil, I think sometimes we live too much about that, where it's always about, oh, well, I'm in heaven, so that's out there. So as long as I just tithe my 10%, only miss about 4 Sundays, maybe I can miss 8, because, during the summer it's vacation, and God knows that we need vacation. And so there's just this little litany, this little checklist of, well, as long as I stay within this column, my salvation is, because it's secured, right? Because I said yes. Never taking into account that flip side of, because we say love your neighbor as yourself, we don't take into the consideration that, well, first and foremost, so Jesus is saying that that's great, but if you neglect the love of those that hate you, then you're not my disciple. And that's some harsh language, because I don't know. I think the three of us, if we allowed ourselves to be super fleshy, there's a couple of people that we could easily say they're a piece of what, because we don't see, or it's easy not to see the intrinsic value in someone in front of you who you don't like, or who's wrong. Like, I have to be honest, a lot of times on my runs, when I'm asking the Lord to help cleanse me, he brings people to mind that, man, if I saw them, I would just like, I haven't forgiven. And that means that, dude, when I don't forgive, I'm not living out the love that Christ calls me to, right? So bringing that reality to me, when I'm around community, it's good to hear those stories, but sometimes I have to admit that I go, yeah, but you don't understand, right? Like, even when I step into your both lives, and you've had things happen where I'm like, oh man, I don't know if I could handle that. I still, though, have a selfishness that says, yeah, but you know what? It's different. Like, if I could have this or have that, then I would be as faithful as, Phil is, or as Jim is. But they don't understand, like, there's something deeper rooted in me. And it's almost like we have this subtle form of competitive victimization within the Christian culture. Like I have to have like, well, your life is pretty, I want to love like you're telling me, but you don't understand like my martyrdom, what it cost me to do what you're, how do we get people out of that though, where they actually start to see, dude, when you start loving and embracing and making space for the other, you actually, your life just, it blooms and I become more of who I was created to be in theory. And I have got it, dude, you're going for a doctorate, Phil, you're finishing a doctorate, Jim, you've got multiple advanced degrees. I've got advanced degrees. And yet, and I know God is love. It's hard for me to wrestle with that though, when it butts up against my wants, you know, and thy will be done, change, becoming part of my heart. That is I feel like that's the competition that we don't wrestle with, is how do I become the Christian that I was created to be?
Yeah, part of that, I know I brought up earlier about appreciating our story, how we're, I didn't say it that way, but learning to love ourselves. Bound to that is learning how to appreciate and love our story, how we come about, but understanding that others have a unique story as well. I, golly, I'm gonna say this, aren't I? All right, so I lost my father just a couple weeks ago, and my father, I have about 5 other siblings from my father, couple in the United States, couple in Jamaica. And so we've been kind of getting together over Facebook, chatting with one another, handle arrangements and those kind of things. And growing up and having siblings that I've never had the opportunity to meet, to talk to, things like that. I'm like, wow, that's weird. And you know, now because we're trying to get together, it's like, I don't know these people. They're in their 30s. I don't even know what to do with them. And then I was talking to a friend the other day, and he started telling me about his story. I never knew anything about his story, but he was telling me about his mother and how his mother married someone 10 years younger than him after his father died. And I was like, what? And then he was going through sharing his story to me, and he was just like, yeah, all of us kind of deal with embarrassing stories somehow or another with our childhood, and we just kind of have to figure out how to deal with it, as I'm trying to figure out how to deal with mine. And so understanding that we all have something about our story that makes it unique, that makes it special, that if we just think about it, not ignore it, not deny it, but if we just kind of think through it and understand that other people have those stories, that's a touch point that we can actually build off of and say, okay, well, my plight isn't as great as yours, but no, we all have our things that made our plight challenging. So yeah, let's work together, figuring out how to get our plights not as challenging.
You know, yeah, I like that. Thanks for sharing that, Phil. You know, and I think to me, what it says also is making sure that we have relationships and friendships of people that are going to be honest, you know, honest about, you know, what it's like. Because as Phil was sharing that story, Phil and I, part of a denomination where we have a midwinter. And so, you know, it's kind of a time for all, you know, people to get together, pastors to get together and just, you know, kick back. But I remember one time I'm sitting in the lobby, and a friend of mine who's part of a multi-staff church, you know, there was like 5 or 6 of them going out for dinner. And I just sat there and I just thought, wow, and they're laughing and kind of this camaraderie, and, you know, they're going together. And so I'm part of a small church. And so it's just me. So I'm only in the playground by myself, but I'm thinking, look at all these people, they get like playmates and all that. And I was kind of envious, you know, I mean, I longed for that. And so I remember a couple of years later, I was talking to my buddy. I said, you know, I sat there and I remember just longing to be part of that group, longing to be a church that was bigger. And he told me, he goes, you know what? Those are the worst years of my life. He says, you know, even during that moment, it looked really good and fun, but there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of frustration. There was a lot of anger there. And, you know, and so, you know, being able to hear stories like that, you know, because we do want to kind of like think, oh, you know, that the grass is greener mentality. But, you know, the reality is that, you know, there's, you know, the people that we might be looking over and longing to be in their yard, they're looking and yearning to be in our yard. And so I think that being able to be around people that are honest enough to say, you know what, it is tough, it is hard, you know, to be around people that when you say, hey, what does it mean to be great in the kingdom of God? It means scrubbing out the toilets. You know, it means, you know, if a homeless person throws up, you walk over and you help clean them up. I mean, that's, you know, that's what a winner looks like in the kingdom of God. And so I think, surrounding ourselves with the right people. And again, it's the stories. It's taking the time to hear other people's stories instead of just imposing what we think and what we would, and maybe we impose what we wish we had, right? Instead of, the real story. But yeah, Phil, I like that. Just that idea of just the story, being able to hear that, and you're going like, whoa.
And you don't, and the thing is, again, this is the complexity of humanity, right? Is that it's not to share stories to say, oh, well, let me share what my woes too, to show you how bad, or it's not to share stories to say, look at how much better I am because I've suffered more than you, right?
Absolutely.
It's like this, because when you start doing it legitimately, like when we start to intersect our narratives, right? And wrote this article about how we all get stuck in these boxes, where we don't recognize that we're in a box because we're so, and Jim, you talked about this, we're around a homogenous group, right? Everyone thinks like us. And so when we talk about diversity, a lot of times it's not diversity of thought, it's usually diversity of appearance. Just make sure that you have people who look different with the picture, right? Color, size, shape, everything, and make sure. And so we have catchphrases, like catch pictures, right? You have your token, make sure you have someone in a wheelchair, make sure you have someone who's black, make sure a little less black, a little less brown, and make sure you have someone big, that's tall, make sure you're someone that's rounder, and this kind of thing. And so then when we start talking about sharing narratives, it's more so about, again, a tick in the box. So I can say, I'm totally inclusive and I'm totally diverse because, dude, I got two friends, that have diverse backgrounds. In fact, they come from other cultures than America. And so like, I've got diversity in my life, because I share their stories, and then it becomes a superficial. And so again, there's always this complexity of helping people to see, like, to enter into the core of who I am. It's not just listening to my story, it's actually embracing it, and so that you can make space for me, right? That I need to make space for you is not just listening to you. It's actually then taking you in and saying, oh, well, when there's a need or when there's a hurt, I'm not to step in and fix everything all the time. It's for us to do this together. And the question of, how can I be with you, right? And I think that's where the competitive nature comes into to distort things, is that we want to compete to be the Messiah or whatever. We need to fix it. And hey, you're going to be better if you understand it. Like I had, my wife and I will sometimes we'll be talking and I'll just say to her, I say, dude, if these people would just think like the Farlows, the world would be a better place, right? Well, I mean, that's just obviously not okay. And yet sometimes I think we do that as Christians. And like, dude, if people would just understand, like, we're just better people. And I think, like that's that inoculation, that vaccine of like, well, once we say yes to Jesus, we're vaccinated from stupidity and meanness. That's not the case, And so how do we continue to live authentically, right? To compete. So is there a form of competition though in the church that you guys would say is okay? That's good.
Oh man.
Especially in light of the Olympics, everyone's like, oh, we're taking medal counts and all this. Like, what would a Christian Olympics look like? Would it look the same? Or like, do we have to have that such a bifurcation of Christian, non-Christian? Because that's what we get into, secular, sacred kind of stuff. How does the Christian compete, live in today's culture, and still work for transformation?
It wouldn't work with the Olympics, wouldn't quite work with Christians, because we'd all be giving away at our best, we'd be giving away our medals. We'll be going gold medal would go to the last place person, be like, you know what? I saw you working hard, you put all your effort into it. Here is your medal. And you would do stuff like that, but just who would be the most to love? How would we compete with serving those who need help? Oh man.
They'd be probably different competitions.
Say what?
They'd probably be different competitions, right? Like
it would be
instead of that.
But even like, it's a trip, because even when we try to help people, we compete in that way, and then we mess things up. So yeah, I want to say that it would be a race to who could love more, but I don't even know if we could do that right. I'm sorry, I'm too cynical. I need to stop.
Yeah.
I'm still thinking that if I learn and think like Matt Farlow, my life will be a whole lot better. So I'm still just pondering on that. Matt, I mean, like, and maybe this happens in wrestling, right? And maybe this happens within your own circle. I think that, I think competitive is good. I mean, being competitive is healthy, because I think, there's certain areas where when you compete with the best, or, there's somebody that you compete with that's a little bit better than you, that's important. But also at the same time, I think there's a respect. I mean, there's some, where people will compete with one another, and, they'll try to, I don't know, outdo them or whatever, because that's the venue of sports. But at the end, there's a lot of respect. It's, and I think maybe that's where it is that we're not trying to compete to win, but, we look at somebody that it's kind of like, look at your elders, look at those that have gone before you, look at look at the leaders that have gone before you. I mean, there's, they're establishing something, like, look at their lives and try to, aim towards that. And so I think, and maybe competitive isn't a good word, but I think the issue becomes, who do we respect? Who is it the person who sets the bar for us, right?
Mm.
And there's people in my life where, I've set the bar pretty high. And even if I can't make the bar, they're there to say, hey, work on this, or, and it's kind of like in cooking, right? It's those people that share the recipe. It's those people that share the, quote, the secret recipe. And you want to cook as well as they do, and you want it to come out, but they're the ones that say, you know what, this is what I use, right? Nothing's a secret. And maybe in wrestling, there's all these moves, right? But somebody says, hey, Matt, here, try this move, but they're willing to kind of help you become a better person. And so maybe that is finding those people that we, and I think, competitive, the other thing too about competitive, it's not only winning, right? It's kind of like the martyr, right? I mean, in the Christian context, it's competitive to be the lesser person too, right? Oh, yeah, I've given up this, or I've given up that. And so, being competitive, like even when we started out, Phil, right? I'm not competitive. Well, I'm less competitive than you. I mean, competition goes all kinds of ways. It's not about only winning, but it's also about being the greatest martyr. But I think that there's a healthy competitiveness if we, if it betters us, I mean, if it and that we can respect. I mean, there's a sense of respect. So I think it's a kind of that complexity. But that's an interesting comment, you make as I process this, through about competitiveness.
And one more thing, and Jim, you said it well, in talking about respecting one another. As a church, seeing that we're all on the same team. I mean, we have all the different teams maybe playing different events and different venues and the like, but we're all on the same team, and understanding who our adversary is, and our adversary is not one another. That's probably one of the biggest things we can take to this. We have an adversary that's trying to take us out, and he's doing a good job of it at times. And we just forget that he's trying to do this, and we're on the same team. Let's remember that. So
yeah, that's a good point. And that's something that we're going to continue. Next week, we want to continue this. So we're pushing into community. If anyone's ever read Screw Tape Letters from C.S. Lewis, the senior devil tells the junior devil, the greatest way to disrupt community is within the church is to have them look down the pews, start to judge, start to critique. And so we're going to continue this because we've all three talked about the need for community, the push into community. Sometimes though, the community can swallow up the individual. So how do we do that to keep our distinctness, but still understand our need for the other? And this is the triune relationality that Christianity continues to talk about, and New Wine talks about all the time, the relational push, the triune God being relational. So we're created in this relational image, and thus we need each other. We're caught up in this mutual network that Dr. King talks about, that what happens to me, whether directly or indirectly, it happens to you. And so we need one another. And so next week, we're going to talk about this, the push into community, but not the loss of individuality. And so on behalf of Phil and Jim, we're so stoked that you joined us today. This is the thing. We want to continue to press into what does it mean to be a Christian in the 21st century? And we need each other because my perspective is so narrow and so limited. And so by dialoguing with one another, hopefully we expand that just a little bit. And it starts with me. And that's what we're inviting you to do. So we're stoked that you joined us today for New Wine UnCorked. Look for the video to be put up if you missed this live, or you have friends who missed this live taping. Let them know that it'll go up Sunday or Monday, the tape version, as well as other aspects of New Wine. You have New Wine tastings. And I talked about then New Wine UnCorked and then New Wine Table Talks. We have previous versions of that. Or head on over to the Facebook page. We have New Wine Skins on Facebook, where we'll have articles or we'll have happenings of new wine that's going on. Because the idea is not to engage the other so as to make them like me, but to engage together so as to realize who we are, so as to see the beauty and the profundity of what it means to be created in the image of this loving God. So on behalf of my brothers, Jim and Phil, I'm Matt. This has been New Wine Uncorked. Till next time, we'll see you on the flip side. Have a good one.